So today I thought that I would do a softly spoken ramble. And when I was thinking about what subject I should talk about, as always, either the mind remains blank, so I have to go and search for some things, or make it up on the spot, or a vast array of subjects just pop into my head and I never know which ones to choose. Sometimes I link them up and we talk about a couple of things, but today one thing did remain in my mind, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about because, well, why not? When I began to research my family history, it was at a time when I felt very alone, very disconnected from people. In truth, I've always felt like the black sheep of the family, and I am in many ways that. I will always be that. But I wanted to find something that so I could feel connected, something that made me feel like I belonged. And I figured that maybe this could be it, to find my roots, to learn the stories of the people who passed before me, and find out maybe if I was like these people, if there was something about me that I could find in one of them. Did it really change anything? I mean, no. Aside from the fact that you do get an immense confidence from knowing where you're from and who you're from, knowing your roots, knowing exactly what they are and who they are, knowing that there's people who fought and struggled and strived, and it can be heartwarming. But also, I wasn't prepared for some of the stories that I would find. So if there was one bit of advice that I would give to anyone who is seeking to find their history, is be prepared for the people you unlock, because not all of them will be nice. Not all the stories are sweet and funny and heartwarming. Some of them are horrid. Some of them are terrifying. Some of them are just downright evil. It depends who's in your tree. Not everyone is nice. Not everyone is salt of the earth. There are some downright dastardly creeps in your tree waiting for you to unlock. And then there's the lovely ones. Just have to be prepared for everything. So when I began, I didn't know anything about my family tree. The most extensive knowledge I had was the names of my mother's grandparents, so my great-grandparents. I only knew them. My father's side of the tree was completely blank. And this is probably where I should start, because this is an interesting story. The only bit of information I had was about my grandfather, his father. The story was that he fought in the First World War, and that he was Scottish, and he was killed at the Somme. He left behind a wife who no one knew her name. Certainly my father did not, but no one knew her name. And my grandfather, who was just a boy, and his older brother, and his sister. I thought this would be easy to find. A Scottish man living in the Welsh hills of the Rhondda in the early 1900s who joined the army and got killed. So I pulls up the 1910 census, and I find out that my grandfather's father was not Scottish. He was Welsh, born in a little town in Monmouthshire. But he wasn't Scottish. He was born to a Welsh father and a Welsh mother. He'd moved to the Rhondda as a young boy and married a dressmaker called Myfanwy, who was my great-grandmother. I had the name of my grandfather's mother. I had unlocked 2 mysteries, 2 untruths and lies. Now, I thought this was just little semantics, little things that can be distorted through time or mistaken, just misheard. It's easily done. And as time goes on, people misremember things. It's easy. So, the biggest thing, I learned that my great-grandfather was a builder and a contractor, and he owned a company in the Rhondda, and he had people working for him. This was something new I'd found. I didn't know that he was a builder. I assumed that he was working in the coal mines, but he wasn't, which is a good thing, because at the time in the Rhondda, the coal miners were going through some really bad stuff, and I forget the year, but one year Winston Churchill did set the army on the rioting coal miners. So, but now I had to find his army record, find where he joined, find what regiment he fought in, and find ultimately where he died. So this is what I set out to do. The goal was to find him, because he'd seemingly been forgotten and it didn't sit well with me. So I began, and I couldn't find his army record. Now this isn't exactly odd. Because during the Second World War, the officers that held these records from the First World War had been hit by a bomb. So a lot of the records had been damaged or just completely destroyed. I did, however, find a death record for a man with the exact same name, the exact same birth, and where he was from, everything like that. So, given that there was no one else in that area at that time with the same birthday or year as my great-grandfather, I naturally assigned that record to my great-grandfather. His name was William, and he was 32 when he was killed in 1916 in the Somme, in a battle where the British Army first introduced the tanks into warfare. It was a particularly horrific battle that saw Canadians and South Africans and Welsh regiments fighting together, and the tanks basically turned the field into a stream filthy with mud. These men just sunk into the mud, and it was a particularly horrid demise. It fit with the description of William's demise, how he was never found. His name is on the memorial, so I'd found him. He was also on the memorial in the town where he and his wife and his children lived. I also unlocked another child, a younger one, which miraculously my father remembered after. Anyway, so I'd found him. There he was. I'd found his last resting place, where he died. I thought. And here's where it gets interesting. Last year, the government released the 1920 census. So 1921. 1921 census. I think it was last year. Anyway, it was last year when I decided to look. So I was pretty excited because I could see my grandparents, my grandfather, a little boy with his parents, and my grandmother, a little girl with her parents. But when I typed in my paternal grandfather, I was astounded to find that he was living in his house with his mother and his grandmother and his father, who had supposed to have died in 1916. Yet here he was in 1921, William, alive and well, running his business, building and contracting, with his wife. I was confused. And my initial response was, well, somebody's lying here. Was it my grandfather? Was it my father? Who was lying? Somebody is lying. Because that man did not die in the Somme. That man did not die. In fact, William died in the 1960s. An old man. His wife, Mifanwi, had heart problems, and she died young in the early 1920s. And William never remarried. But I was left with this, who was lying? Who lied? But then I remembered, his name is on the memorial in that town. It's him. There is no other man in that town with that name of that age except him. His death record with the military is there. There was no other man of that name, of that age, in that regiment. It was him. So, what happened? I know he didn't die. He's recorded in the 1921 census. I have his death record in the 1960s. So, what happened? And I wonder now if this could be a case of one of those many instances where men were reported to have died, missing in action. And that's why his name is on the monument. That's why his name is on the record. But he wasn't. Like, maybe he was a prisoner of war or something along those lines, and then he returned home. That's the line I'm going with. But I feel like if that was the case, that would be an even bigger story, an even bigger miracle than this man went to war and he didn't return. Like, these little boys, this little girl, kissed their father goodbye at a train station and they never saw him again. It's a happy story, surely. It's that moment where everything is bleak and everything is lost, and then suddenly, through the clouds, the sun shines. But for some reason, it wasn't. And I don't really know why. I guess that some things, like many things, are lost to time. Many stories are just never spoken, never passed down, so they become lost. The only person who would really know was the people who were there. Surely my grandfather, who in 1921 is a teenager and oddly working for the council, which, if you know my family, you know that's something that is really not something that anyone would do. Especially when you consider that my grandfather had a strong dislike of things like that, councils and police and military. He didn't really like those things. My father wanted to join the Metropolitan Police, and because he was quite young at the time, you needed your guardians or your parental figure's signature to join, and he just put his foot down. No son of mine is joining the police. And he never did. The very same sentiment is passed down to us when you want to join the military. Never fight for your country, because what will it do for you? You'll return broken, and that is a sentiment from him. That's something that's passed down to his children and his grandchildren, and because there was a time when I did contemplate joining the military. I remember being a teenager, and they came around to the schools, like they always do. They show a very, very, very glamorized idea of the military, that you can sit on sun-kissed Caribbean beaches and sunbathe. Look, here's a hammock. I remember the still and the slides. A couple of months later, British and American forces invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And because of that, a lot of the boys in my year joined the military, and one didn't return. So finding these stories is interesting, because sometimes you have to become the detective. You have to put things together, puzzle pieces, and sometimes they don't fit, just like the story. I'm almost a decade into this story, and I started with nothing. And I find out this now, but it still isn't finished. And I think I have to come to terms with the fact that unless I stumble upon somebody who was told the story for real, who knew it, who lived it, then I will never, ever know. Ever. And for somebody like me who needs to solve everything, that can be a little bit jarring to realize. But it is what it is, I guess. There will be some surprises. Of course, there always is with everything. One of the biggest surprises for me was to discover my Quaker ancestors. My Quaker ancestors lived in Bath and Bristol, and I was lucky enough to find their histories. They documented everything, and the minutes of their meetings. And my ancestors were soap makers. They made themselves rich by that, and they made themselves very wealthy by making soap. One of the funniest things I found, and something that I could identify with, was an ancestor, a great-great-great-great-great-great-mother in 1690 something. She was young, about 18, and she was always going to the theatre And I guess the Quakers didn't approve of the theatre and actresses and actors, such scandalous things. But she would never stop. And the complaint was that she wouldn't stop. So they brought it up in this meeting. And her father, who was a man called Charles Harford, needed to do something about it because she was just out of control. I also discovered some sadness. I found that the Quakers of this time were persecuted for their religion. They didn't follow traditional Christian practices, Protestant or Catholic. So they were persecuted. They were harassed, and one description in the minutes that I found was a raid on my ancestors' home, and how they arrested even my great blah blah grandmother and threw her into a stinky dungeon prison for no reason. She hadn't done anything. She was just a wife and a mother. And this was just before the plague struck again in 1666. Luckily, things became easier. A lot of that family at the time were involved in the abolition of slavery and prison reform. Like Elizabeth Fry was connected to the family and the Quakers. In the 1790s, I have an ancestor, a great grandmother called Hannah Walker, and at the time she was married. She was very young, and she was married to a man called Christopher, and he was in the armed forces, and they had 2 or 3 little children. And at the time, the country was going through a rough patch. Food was expensive, and it was given to the military. An army marches on its stomach. We're on the eve of the 19th century. 1800 is coming fast, and the 1700s is soon to be a long-distant memory. We're also on the eve of war with France. This big, long, angry war with France. Everything's brewing. A revolution has just taken place. The royal family isn't very popular, and the Prince Regent is a laughingstock. But the poor, as always, have nothing, they're bereft. So Hannah, along with many other people, take place in Tewkesbury, a thing called the Bread Riots, where they protested the lack of food for their children and them. Hannah and her contemporaries are arrested. They're convicted. Luckily, they escape death, because in another part of the country there are women who do the same thing and they are given death. There is a theory that Hannah escaped it because she was a mother, but the other women who rioted weren't, and they also escaped it. So I think it may just be that it was a different magistrate, different judge. You never know. So Hannah spends a year in prison. Now, is she a model prisoner? No, she gets involved in fights and she gets thrown into solitary confinement. But she eventually gets out. She gets reunited with her children, who I can only assume has been looked after by her mother or by her sisters. And I don't know what happened to Christopher. He died at some point. I don't know when or how. I looked in to see if he was killed in the war with France, but I couldn't find anything, and I didn't have any proof his name isn't in the local register in Tewkesbury, so I don't know. All I know is that Hannah married my great whatever grandfather, and they owned a shop in Tewkesbury. Now, what is interesting about this bit is, although my great-great-great-grandfather had 4 sons, he didn't leave his shop to any of his sons. He left it to his eldest daughter, a woman called Jemima, who was his eldest daughter by his first wife. I'm descended from his second wife. And this, to me, is a little bit innovative. A man who leaves his store, his life's work, his everything he worked for in life, not to a son, but to his daughter. And Jemima had that store all to herself. She owned it until she was in her mid-50s when she finally got married. And then he was classed as the owner, which sucks because it's Jemima's store. As she got old, her eyesight failed, so she needs the help more. And her husband passes away, so her sister, Martha, is there more. And I think at some point she moves in with her children and her husband, and they help her. George, Jemima and Martha's brother, who was my great-great-great-grandfather. Like many young English men at the time, moves to Wales, whether it's temporary or not, to work in the coal fields, work in the coal mines. And there he meets my great-great-grandmother. Great-great-great-grandmother. And he never leaves. Ever. Their daughter, Margaret, she had 3 husbands. All died. All of them. And it's at that point where you have to ask yourself, do I have a black widow in the family? Because you never know. 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 And there's one story that I always find a little sad, because it is. On my father's side, in this small Devonshire village right on the coast, right on the coast, so far on the coast that during the Armada, during the Spanish Armada, the people of the village were able to stand on the beach and watch the fight between the English and the Spanish fleets. There was no TV in those days. They had to do something for entertainment, you understand. And if 2 opposing fleets come upon your shoreline and start beefing it out, I'm sure that you too would be glued to the scene. So let's not judge. Let's not judge them. But anyway, in this small Devonshire village, there's a young girl. Her name is Elizabeth. She's small. She's a little girl. She's the youngest of like 10. And that's the only good thing about this story, because when she's very young, her father dies, and then quickly after, her mother dies. And the only good thing is that she has older sisters who can look after her. So that's what happens. But when she becomes of an age where she can't really stay in their house anymore, she needs to do something about that. And as she's a woman, the traditional thing is for her to get married. But I guess somehow she ended up having to marry, being 17 years old, a man who was like 50. He was a warrener. And that means he was a man who had permission from the lord of the manor to kill rabbits. He quickly afterwards had a very dramatic career change when he became the headmaster of the school. So in months he went from killing rabbits to a headmaster. Such a vast career change, just like 180, just a complete 180. And he was widowed, and he had adult children who were slightly older than Elizabeth. A lot of them, boys, went to America, and that's where they stayed. They settled in Massachusetts and Connecticut, which ironically is where that family already had roots, because they'd gone to America on the fleet that was just after the Mayflower in the 1630s or something like that. I can never remember the name of it though. And the only reason that our branch of the family returned to England was because my ancestor, his name was Randall, and he was a sailor. And he had a wife in America, in Massachusetts, and a child. But he sailed to England, and one of those, again, seaside towns, coastal towns, and met my ancestor, and was so beguiled by her, so enthralled, that he never went back. He left his wife, and he left his child, and, well, he became a bigamist, essentially. He married, and they had a life together, and that's where we stayed. But they returned to there, and I do have some stories of a grandchild of this man who was a policeman in late 1800s Massachusetts. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, she's 17. She marries this guy who's 50. He already has all these older children. She's so young and has so many children. The eldest son is my great-great-grandfather. His name was Moses. And I think there was about 12 others. She's often pregnant. But by the time that she's 40, her husband is old. Her children are growing. But I guess she's not fulfilled. She's had this sad life, one that she didn't really choose. And then I found her in the 1881 census in Lancashire with another man. And at first I was thinking, maybe it's not her, maybe it's somebody else. But no, it was her. It was her, because she even had some of her younger children with her. It was her. And I realized something. She married that man, even though her husband was still alive. So this is another story that I have that is completely there's so many holes in the story. All I know is she lives in a small Devonshire village. She's 40. Her husband is old. Like old. And then one day, this guy, who's her age, strolls up into the village. And I guess she likes what she sees. And somehow, some way, she leaves with him and her younger children. And I'm kind of torn on how I think about that. Because in one way I'm thinking, okay, so she gets to have something that she's chosen for once. She gets to do that. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, but what about that man, her husband, her first husband? Like, you've taken his children away. You've left him alone. Because the older children have all left. They've either emigrated to America or Australia, or they've joined the Navy, or they've moved to London. They're not present in his life. He's entirely on his own, and he's all alone. So I don't know, I'm torn. I'm torn between saying, yeah, go for it, Elizabeth. Really just happy that you decided to live for yourself for once, to choose what you want to do with your life. Because she clearly wasn't happy. But then also a little bit sad. But then I don't know what any of these people were like. I don't know what Elizabeth's life was like. I don't know what her first husband was like. Their eldest son, who was my great-great-grandfather, he was working on the rails. He was a labourer on the railways. And he had a lot of ill health. Whether it was physical injuries, or at one point he had a severe eye problem that meant he was in and out of the hospital having operations, and never really found out what that was about. But at some point they moved to London. My great-grandfather as well. Just a little boy, they leave Torquay and they go to London. They lived in Torquay at the time of a very, very violent and bleak murder that occurred when a very rich, very, very rich spinster was violently murdered in her home. And I think it was her maid's brother who was arrested and tried for the crime. The interesting thing in that is that they tried to execute him, but it failed. So they tried to do it again, but it failed again. And he said something along the lines of, "The Lord won't let me die," or something like that. And no, they was never executed. I think I would leave town as well if something like that happened. If I'm honest, it was a very grisly murder. I obviously don't know if that's why they left, but it happened while they were there. One can imagine that it was bleak. When something like that happens in a small place, then it becomes something that everyone talks about, something that everyone's afraid of, especially when no one knows who it is. And his ill health catches up with him, and he dies in 1906. He's not an old man, but he's not a young man. He's like about 50. And his wife, who's called Eliza, she's a Cornish lady from a small town in Cornwall. Her family are well established in that place, and the lineage goes back to the 1500s. But she's left with a problem. How does she earn a living? She still has some young teenage daughters with her. So, how does she do it? Well, it seems that at this time, my family are involved in restaurants and cafes because her eldest daughter, or one of her eldest daughters, owns a restaurant with her husband. So Eliza becomes the chef in Chelsea, in a restaurant in Chelsea. I've tried to find the address because that's where they are in 1911, but I haven't been successful. But I haven't given up. The nearest location I could find is on this very busy road full of, still to this day, restaurants and cafes and bars. I think it could be somewhere in that area. But again, I haven't given up. One of my favorite stories, one of my absolute favorite stories, is that of my ancestor, Mary. And she's born into this rich, wealthy, affluent family. You know, her uncle owns this seat in Herefordshire. It's old. Goes back to Elizabethan times. Still there to this day, only it's a hotel now. Kind of trades on ghost stories, but I've debunked them all, so the ghost stories aren't real. Anyway, the reviews for the place are terrible, so I won't be staying there anytime soon. But it still looks, well, I can imagine at the time it looked great. It's on the edge of this lake. It's almost, when I think about it, I have this idea of some Jane Austen adaptation, where the camera zooms in past the water and the shimmering circles that the fish are making, out to this house that has some parts that look Regency, but that's because little bits have been added. And her parents die when she's very young, so she and her brothers and her sister go to become wards of their uncle, who is a Tory MP. This is something that I also was not really happy to discover because, well, I don't really want to be related to a Conservative MP, but what can I do? Anyway, so Mary ends up running off, eloping, if you will, with the groom, who is from a family who has a little bit of money, but not as much as a wealthy man would allow his niece to marry, if you get my drift. So he's poor, essentially. Anyway, so Mary sees this guy. He's called Evan, and he's Welsh. So she sees him, and clearly she likes what she sees. So they run off. She grabs a couple of things for their life together, and she elopes with Evan. I don't think she ever saw her family again. Ever. And her nephew, her oldest brother's only child, inherited the estate from her uncle. And her nephew is a very studious man. He loves books, he loves learning, he loves everything like that. So he marries this woman, this young, beautiful woman. And he's still addicted to his books, to his studies. So one night, he's in his study, and he's reading, but he goes up to bed a little bit too early. And what does he find? Well, I'll tell you what he finds. He finds his wife and his neighbor in a situation where, how can one say, the neighbor isn't exactly asking for a cup of sugar. It was one of the first public instances of divorce in England. It was all over the tabloids. It was everywhere. The family were disgraced. Everything. Their only child, a daughter, inherited the house after her father's death, and her parents split, divorced. She was, however, not kept from her father or her mother. Literature kind of gives us this cruel stories about children who are kept from parents. Very Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina. I feel like I said it wrong the first time. But her name was Charlotte. She was the last person to own that house. She never married. She had no children. She had no siblings. Her father had no siblings. Trying to go back and see if I have a right to that place, because I really just, think I'd enjoy being the owner of a big house. Maybe. No. Too much hoovering. Anyway, when she died, it became property of whatever trust. And it was empty for a long time before it was turned into a hotel. I just realized that my family is full of stories of scandalous affairs and my own grandfather was a bigamist. Because when he returned from the war, he married my grandmother whilst being married to his first wife. And I did think this was really scandalous, but apparently this wasn't uncommon, because divorce was such a hard thing to do then. And when war happens, and everybody returns from war, not only are the men who are sent to fight, not only are they changed and become someone else, but also their wives are somebody else. They've met new people, they've become someone else, they've moved on. It's this really sad thing that two people who could be in love at the start can have completely just drifted away from each other and become somebody else at the end. It's quite sad if you think about it. My great-grandmother, another Hannah, a different Hannah. Her name was Hannah Maria. And when she was young, she went and got married. She married to a young English coal miner who lived in the Welsh Hills. And when she was only a couple of months pregnant with their first and only child, he died, and she was a young widow on the eve of motherhood. Luckily, she wasn't alone. She had a mother and a father and a lot of sisters and brothers, So she had the child. But for some reason, she then went to London, where she worked in service. And I guess it was because to send money back home for her parents and her child. And this is where the scandalous thing occurs. Her deceased husband's older brother is a policeman in the Metropolitan Police. Hannah is a witness at his wedding to his first wife. She's an Irish woman. Her name is Catherine. They end up having 2 children, a boy and a girl. But something happens. Hannah Maria, becomes pregnant with a child of her deceased husband's older brother, who's married and has children. So Hannah, what do you do in this situation? It's not exactly the kind of situation where they can just get married and, move on, like what often happened in those days. She has to leave London, of course. She goes home to her parents, and she marries somebody else. Because what she's supposed to do. He's a lot older than her. A lot older than her. His children are all adults. And I did question the validity of that. It's not like you can actually do a DNA test until I saw pictures of her husband's brother, and it was like looking at my grandfather, but with a mustache. It was crazy. It was like looking at him. It was so weird. So I don't really question that anymore. I just think that Hannah Maria was a little bit loose. She was also married 3 times. Her third and final husband was 15 years younger than her. 15 years younger than her. Hannah was a bit of a cougar, one could say. Another story that I found. This one is just dastardly. It happens in Devon. And I'm related to the husband. He is a distant uncle. And one day, he decides that he doesn't have anything to gamble with. He's given it all away. He doesn't want to lose his house or the objects inside. Doesn't have money. And the only thing that he has of worth to gamble is his wife. So, one night, he goes and plays cards with this man. And he says, "I bet you my wife." And the man takes the bet. And he loses. So he gives his wife to the man. Now, luckily, there are laws about this. Otherwise, that woman would have just been handed over to anyone just because her husband lost at cards. But luckily, she had the foresight to go to the police, and they helped her. Because there were laws that you cannot gamble or sell your wife, but he did. Nothing happened to him. He got a slap on the wrist, really, and the police were like, "Sir, you cannot gamble your wife." And she moved back in, But I can't imagine that things were smooth and plain sailing for him after that day. You try to put your wife up as collateral on a game of cards and you lose, and then just happily go, well, take her away, take her away. She's not gonna like that. Well, she's not gonna like that at all. She's not gonna like that. I've done a lot of stories. I have probably a million more. I'm gonna end with one more because I wanted this to be a longish kind of ramble. People kind of like long ones sometimes, and I felt like talking, I guess, felt a little bit lonely tonight, so decided to fire this up and record something. In the 1830s, there's a man, my great-grandmother's distant cousin, really, Somerset, in England, and he's an agricultural labourer, so he goes from farms to farm looking for work. There isn't really a lot of work. He comes to this one farm. He's called George, by the way. He's in his early 40s. He isn't married and he has no children. He's from a big family. His brothers have all settled down. They all have wives and children, but George just never managed to do it. And he asks the farmer for work, and the farmer doesn't like the look of him. Doesn't like him. Says no. So George goes away, and then in the meantime, a little while later, a bale of hay is found on fire. And the farmer is just aghast at this bale of hay that's on fire, and they put the fire out. But the authorities are called, and the farmer fingers George. Points the finger. I'm not trying to say anything else, just move along quickly. George is arrested, put on trial. You have to remember, this is a time when the Luddites, it's illegal to destroy farm labor and stuff like that. So he's on trial for his life just because a bale of hay was on fire. Nobody saw him do it. There's no witnesses. He hasn't confessed. He never confessed. Ever. Even at the end, just before his execution, he never confessed. Because he didn't do it. But the farmer said he did, and that was enough. Nobody saw him. I repeat, nobody saw him. Nobody saw him near it. Nobody saw him around it, except for when he went to the farm that day to ask for work. But the farmer wants to blame someone. It could have been an accident, really. It could have been. He's found guilty. And his punishment is to hang. And so that's what happens. It's a really sad story, but one that starts off so mundane, so boring, so just this guy going to look for work. That's it. That's how the story begins. And then it ends like that. You know, his mother lost her child, and she had to watch. One thing that I always find so unsettling about this time at the public executions is seen as entertainment. Food is passed around, food is sold. Like when you go to a soccer game or football and you can buy like burgers and hot dogs. It's so strange. I know that some of these people are really evil, but it does seem so macabre to relish. I know we're in different times and we shouldn't really look at the past with modern eyes because it's just never going to work. We're always going to find them wanting. We're always going to think of them almost like brutes, I guess. But it still is macabre. So macabre. Ghoulish. So very ghoulish. There was one interesting thing that I did find. During the reign of Elizabeth I, a name that was very popular among young women, and you're going to think this is strange, but it is very true. The name that is very popular among young women, what parents willingly name their daughters, is the name, and I'm not lying, Virgin. Virgin. I have so many distant aunts called Virgin at this time. First of all, I thought it was a joke. I thought somebody was transcribing something wrong. But they can't all be mistakes. Virgin. Virgin. And I'll end with this. One of my favorite ancestors. A woman. Yes. And her name was Douglas. Okay, everybody. I think I have witted on about, well, family stories. Some scandalous, some sad, some brave. But I hope that you enjoyed them. And until next time,